There's over $1 trillion of waste in supply chains today.
The net zero carbon emission is something that corporates are taking very seriously.
To meet these objectives, they're going to have to take into consideration CO2 emissions.
Hey, and welcome back to another episode of Net Zero Carbon. I'm your host, Tyler Cole, and this is the show at FreightWaves where we deep dive on decarbonization through the lens of freight, fuels, and energy. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Joe Oliaro of Wagner Logistics. How are you, sir?
I'm great.
Good to have you on. I'm excited to hear about what you guys are doing in the ESG space and your role as the Chief Real Estate Officer and the VP of Sales. You're touching a lot of that. I imagine you're getting a lot of live feedback from customers on this topic. So I'm really interested to hear, what's your role at Wagner and maybe just a brief background about the company before we dive in.
Sure. So I have the pleasure of kind of being the megaphone for all good things that Wagner is doing for our customers and around the country. I also oversee our portfolio of roughly 24 different locations. We occupy roughly 7 million square feet in the U.S. And we work with companies big and small. So Fortune 100 companies down through, your mom and pop shops. So we get to see it all. And, I think for our topic today, it's a lot of the encouragement from our customers to, apply sustainable practices comes from larger companies. Interested to get into that.
Absolutely. We're going to dive right in. How, maybe a little bit more so I understand. So you said 7 million square feet roughly. Is there additional services under that? Do y'all have any trucking assets or fleets? Do you do any kitting services? What's the kind of the full scope of what you guys offer customers?
Yeah, so typically we cater well to manufacturers that need a distribution center nearby. So we'll bring in the raw materials for them, shuttle those to the factory, and then bring their finished goods back over to the DC and send them on down the supply chain. We have a number of assets, and then we also have a non-asset based brokerage where we broker out to various carriers that we have a relationship with. But then we also provide value-added services like kitting and pretty competitive with other value-added services that the 3PLs around the country offer.
Super cool. Super cool. Thanks for sharing that. So you're the voice of the customer, the megaphone for the company to customers here. How do you view, warehouses and your specific service in this industry? How do you view that role kind of in the broader net zero supply chain context? How do you guys help move everybody that direction?
I like to think that we are helping global supply chain managers, procurement professionals, senior buyers, supply chain planners to look like heroes. And that's it sounds like a total sales pitch, but I think that role for those folks along the supply chain has evolved substantially to where they've gone beyond the pivot table, and procurement is not just about reducing costs anymore. The value of those professionals has gone beyond that, and they have to lean extra hard on their service providers to give them the information that they need. And sometimes that's harder to quantify than what most people would like.
Exactly right. I love that you're saying it's not just about cost anymore, because we preach that all the time here, right? It used to be, not that it was ever an easy job, because you didn't have all the data and the tools that we have now to get it done, but there's just a higher expectation, right? The expectation now is you deliver service and lower emissions and ESG footprinting as a result of your effort to get lower costs. And it's a much, much more nuanced and difficult job, in my opinion. So, how does Wagner help those folks pursue net zero? Do you guys have specific initiatives? Is there something you guys kind of hang your hat on?
So it varies by customer, but I think some of the low hanging fruit that we as a company have tried to incorporate would be, things like electric material handling equipment, or MHE. Across our organization, we're trying to incorporate electric lifts wherever we can, which just requires installing, a few charging stations in the warehouse. Where we run into obstacles with that is where we have really heavy type product that we have to lift. In some locations, we have large roll stock paper where, we need a propane powered lift with a roll clamp to come in and pick those things up. So in those instances, it's hard to go electric, but everywhere else, we're trying to get there. You've also got LED lighting, and that's kind of a double bonus, because if you can put in sensors that allow the lights to automatically come on and off, then you're only using lighting in the warehouse where you need it. And then the from a functionality standpoint, the LED lighting also services to cater to food grade type facilities and operations as well, so that you're not worried about lights breaking and glass getting into packaging or into food packaging. So there's that to be concerned about. And then, as we're servicing shippers and manufacturers, we're also looking for opportunities to reduce waste. So if we're shuttling raw materials into the factory and we're packing some of those materials into a box truck or something, we would fully expect for those packing materials to come back to us so that we can continue to reuse them until they've gone through their useful life. And that's things like slip sheets, pieces of cardboard that otherwise would fill up a dumpster, and there's a quantifiable cost with that. And then airbags, other types of means of getting product back and forth that we can simply pull right back out of the truck and put back into use for quite some time.
Super exciting. I did not know, I had not ever thought about the food grade opportunity improvement with LED lighting is something that's another layer of nuance that I don't think most people think about. It's always efficiency and cost and not safety, right? And I did not also anticipate all of the I think about dunnage a lot as a way to reduce waste. We think about the same thing with empty miles. If your truck's coming back, that you're making sure you're bringing something home. But I'm curious to know how you work with customers to do that. Do you guys have a formal offering, or it seems like it might be just a relationship thing, right? If we're going to be delivering to you every day, help me help you by getting some of this material back. How do y'all think about managing that aspect of a customer relationship?
Yeah, I think it boils down to a continuous improvement. We're in the midst of incorporating 5S into many of our locations, and it's about that communications. It's about that relationship and that level of partnership. So it's not just, hey, just send it to the warehouse and they'll take care of it. It's, hey, call Joe or call Bob or Jenny and say, hey, here's what's coming over. How can we handle this? Here's our issue. And I mentioned the procurement professionals and the supply chain professionals. They want a partner that's really in tune with their business and can help support their business strategy. Much more so than it used to be. It's not just a bunch of burly warehousemen lifting heavy sacks of grain or whatever commodity it was back in the day. It's a completely different environment. It's a much more diverse environment, and that's required change across the board. The labor, the employment, the environment and atmosphere that 3PLs and warehouses, whether in-house or outsourced, are requiring a much more hands-on approach to see success between the manufacturer and the warehouse.
It's definitely a partnership, and it's something that I think a lot of people overlook when we talk supply chains. A lot of time the focus is on freight. I know in the past I've been guilty of that myself, right? I'm talking about alternative fuels, and that's where the bulk of the emissions are. So that's where we hone in on. But there's so much more that when we talk about break bulk, when we talk about fulfillment, when we talk about e-commerce or even large manufacturing facilities, like that's a real partnership. And I'm curious your perspective on this. A lot of the freight game, the truck game is so transactional, right? It's not always that way, right? There's lots of dedicated opportunities or lots of partnerships, but I've always imagined the warehousing space to be a lot more partnership specific, or at least longer term relationships, because you're dealing with bigger assets that are geographically like nearby where you're servicing your customers most of the time. Is that true? And if so, does that help when you're trying to like formalize an ESG offering to a customer, as an example?
Yeah, I think table stakes is understanding what the general, storage and handling costs are for the products themselves. And then, we're seeing this especially with larger companies where they're asking us to say, hey, how can you help us support these ESG initiatives? And I kind of mentioned earlier, but there's the low hanging fruit that you can quickly quantify within a year time or within the annual budget that this is going to create a certain amount of reduction in costs, or this will allow for that. But then you've also got, I'll just say, additional environmental opportunities that allow you to say, hey, for the community in general, we're going to change the habitat and diversity of the habitat around this industrial park of these big box buildings, simply by planting some native prairie grass like what we have here in Kansas. And by doing that, you not only reduce the amount of landscaping and common area maintenance costs in and around the facility, but you're also encouraging lower water retention, because those native grasses, they suck up more of the water and they put it out in the environment. So you're immediately reducing erosion. You're encouraging more flora and fauna to take root there in that immediate area, usually where there's little to no activity in and around the landscape. So it's a real opportunity to to help just the local flora and fauna take root there. And then, obviously there's solar to talk about. It's, we lease most of our buildings. So it's really just us pinging the landlord and saying, hey, have you considered solar? Here's some partners that we've talked to in the past, or that we would encourage you to partner with if you don't already have some kind of solar solution on the rooftop of your building. I mean, you've got 1 million square feet of space. We might as well take advantage of all this rooftop. Now, I will say, being in the Midwest, all the hail that we get throughout the year is a bit of a challenge, but there's ways around that too.
Yeah, there's definitely a sweet spot for having on-site solar, and warehouse roofs typically are a great one. And that's an interesting dynamic, because that's very common when you're not the owner of the building, you're leasing the space, and you don't have control over I guess they're technically scope 3 emissions if you don't own the building. I know you're paying for the power. I'd have to actually check the manual on that one, but man, then you throw in another wrinkle, just like we have hail coming through. How are we going to make sure this is an investment that pays off? Are you seeing customers come to you guys and looking to partner on like specific cost investment opportunities for things like on-site solar? Are there customers that say, hey, we want to help you reduce your emissions. Let's either sign a longer term contract or figure out a creative way where we can implement some of these solutions? Are you seeing that come in the door yet?
I think the main, not for like solar. I think where we're seeing requests for change is around things that move the needle long term. So most of the discussions we have is around labor, and so we're talking about environmental, but we're also talking about social and incorporating a better environment for employees to encourage retention and increase employee satisfaction throughout the warehouse, and doing things like changing up our employee benefits to where it's more in line with their stage of life, whether they have a family, they're single, on the verge of retirement. And then there's also things, like making sure that they have enough breaks and making sure that they're capable of lifting and operating equipment that they have, that they're cross-trained, and that they're paid a fair wage.
Super important and not to be overlooked. The S gets squeezed in the middle a lot of times in that acronym we use. And it's probably the most important thing that we have, right? We're nothing without our people, and we rely on one another every day. So I'm glad you mentioned that. What's next for Wagner? Like, do you guys have some initiatives for 2023 that you guys are actively campaigning or working on? Or when you look to the horizon, maybe the next even 18 months, like where are you guys focused?
I think we're really looking to partner with procurement and, get them, they've evolved beyond the pivot table, and really give them the answers that they need to make organizational change on their end. And then also, in support of our local communities, being in 24 different markets, we've got a real opportunity to, support our managers and the communities that they live in, sponsoring local initiatives, sponsoring local teams, and getting the word out there, charities, and then also encouraging our suppliers and our vendors to go out and be a part of that as well. From an employee standpoint, it's also about health and wellness. We have a step challenge 2 times a year. We also do a Biggest Loser challenge for folks that want to lose weight. And then also incorporating, environmental health and safety to make sure that everybody feels comfortable in the environment that they're working in. It's funny, we've been doing some research on the Phoenix area. And if you look, 15, 20 years ago, the number of warehouses that had HVAC or, temperature controlled spaces was maybe 20%. And now that's flipped on its head, and it's closer to 80% of those warehouses have temperature control in place. When you think about environmental sustainability, that's a lot of electricity to send to that market. But you can't get the labor there to work on a regular basis in a hot warehouse unless you have, temperature control. So that's a downside to pursuing more labor in a space. You're kind of shooting yourself in the foot.
That's a really interesting observation, because we know supply chain's about trade-offs. Sustainability frequently can be the same, right? We want to talk about, to your point exactly, like taking care of our people might require us to have more electricity usage in some of these warehouses. And as the world gets hotter, that's probably a trend that likely continues in certain areas. And the same conversation is true with electrification for fleets, right? We're shifting, we're still using energy, right? Hopefully we're using less of it, and we're just not combusting diesel to get that. We're using grid electricity or renewables, hopefully, but it's really just a shift, right? And it's all about trade-offs. What do we value more today? So I'm glad you caught that up. That's an interesting observation. I'm curious to you, Joe. I know we could probably go for an hour, but coming up on time at the end of the episode, I ask all my guests that come on the show, what is it about this function of your job, this focus, right? What's your personal motivation to embed sustainability into your daily work?
Part of our governance initiative is to lead by example. I have 2 boys, 7 and 9 years old, and I would love to leave them a legacy of sustainable practices that they can take and evolve themselves. So I think maybe, as a former Eagle Scout, leaving things better than you found them is kind of what I was brought up with, and that's probably part of my motivation. And when I think about making small changes locally that echo globally, I think that's pretty cool to be a part of that kind of change and to really take care of the place where you live and work.
So good. I love that. I've got like a little montage video rolling through my head right now of you and your boys throwing baseball in those pollinator gardens outside the warehouse right now. That's what I'm visualizing. And it's so good. No, I really do appreciate the perspective. I'm glad to hear this is something that Wagner's taking seriously, and even layering in new practices on top of some things that have been, ESG for decades that are now just relabeled as ESG, but we're doubling down on the heart behind them, trying to do a lot of good in our communities and for our people. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for coming on the show. We'll definitely have to have you back on soon.
Yeah, Tyler, appreciate your time today. And yeah, would love to come back.
Awesome. See you, Joe.